Street Fighter 2's cast are masterpieces of character design, because at an arcade cabinet, you get about 2 seconds to grab someone's attention, and Capcom made characters that instantly conveyed entire cultures. And while those shortcuts are a huge reason for the game's international success, they're also the same shortcuts Capcom spent decades unlearning. And the unfortunate reality is that how these characters were made matters. Capcom's team in Osaka didn't have the internet, global consultants, or even easy access to authentic references. Legendary character designer Akira Akiman Yasuda has said he leaned into stereotypes because they were memorable, his exact words being, quote, "If the characters' moves didn't make people laugh, then they weren't good." And you can feel that logic in a character like Dhalsim. Stretchy limbs, fire breathing, and surprisingly a necklace of skulls. I mention that because I don't want to imply zero research was done, because that detail is drawn from a sect of macabre Indian monks known as Kapalikas. But what really says everything about this era of design is that Dhalsim's name came from a dish the developers ate at an Indian restaurant. But Blanca's origin story is far more shocking. The first drafts leaned into a captured savage imagery, a racist trope played completely straight. He eventually became a green jungle mutant, though the team didn't suddenly recognize the original idea as deranged. What actually happened is Akiman played pro wrestling on the NES and was inspired by the character Amazon. So the underlying problem was painted over, not fixed. And I want to be as clear as I can, these designs were in no way malicious. They were efficient, built to communicate country instantly using whatever cultural shortcuts the devs already knew. And because Street Fighter was a hit, that efficiency didn't come into question for a long time, and it explains why these designs persisted unchallenged for so long, because nobody at Capcom thought they were doing anything wrong. See, the media landscape of the early 90s rewarded stereotypes commercially. Capcom correctly learned that cultural representation sells, but the lesson they took much longer to learn is that the quality of that representation matters just as much as its existence. The period between Street Fighter 2 and 6 is where the real story lives, because that's where Capcom began learning through a series of small corrections to their cultural depictions. Dhalsim's journey is the cleanest case study. In 2, he's a starving yogi fighting to raise money for his impoverished village, defined entirely by his exoticism. And by Street Fighter 4 in 2008, he had a wife, a son, and a pet elephant, and his character had shifted into something more original. It's worth noting that I couldn't find a definitive source for this, but the village motive is almost identical to an Indian character from early Dragon Ball called Nam. By Street Fighter 4 though, his character is far more psychologically interesting. He's haunted by the contradiction of using yoga, a practice meant for spiritual enlightenment, for violence. And in Street Fighter V, Dhalsim received his turban and grew a white beard, minuscule changes that nudged him into an actual demographic of Indian men rather than a fantasy of one. And that's a meaningful evolution, and Capcom didn't have to erase anything about his cultural identity to achieve it. They just treated him like a person who always had one. Street Fighter V brought Rashid into the franchise, and the story of his reveal shows how far apart Western criticism and the reactions of the people actually being represented can be. Rashid was revealed at Games 15 in Dubai, where producer Yoshinori Ono introduced him to a Middle Eastern audience that applauded the representation. He was the first Arab character to appear as a fighter in the core series, equipped with a kafia and a tech monocle, utilizing wind-based attacks, and characterized as a wealthy modern tech enthusiast rather than a desert warrior. The Arab gaming community immediately embraced him, though some Western commentators read him as a caricature at first sight. And that reveals a serious problem with how diversity gets discussed. Representation doesn't have one audience. It's shaped by history, context, and who's doing the interpreting, and sometimes people with good intentions end up speaking over the communities they want to defend. I should say I'm using this example as a case study, not a pile-on. In fact, that same day, IGN called him more than a checkmark on diversity and a fun character with a great deal of potential. Revealing Rashid on a relatively small stage in Dubai was a calculated move by Capcom. Showing the character to the represented audience first lets their reaction set the tone, and at the same show, Capcom announced Arabic language support for Street Fighter V. They were actually putting money into the region and not just slapping a character on the roster and calling it done. Capcom was beginning to ask themselves, what would people from this culture want to see? a fundamentally different question from what do we think this culture looks like. Street Fighter VI is where Capcom's approach to representation became institutional. This is the first game where the process behind character design was rebuilt from the ground up. They began incorporating authenticity into a formal part of their development pipeline, with budgeting and a full-time staff. Kimberly is proof of that. She's the first playable African-American woman in Street Fighter, and her creation involved the team hiring external black consultants. Director Takayuki Nakayama explicitly details this. Quote, "A lot of people on the team are fans of black culture. In order to make her as authentic as possible, we spoke with many black employees within the company. We also hired consultants to help us design the character and her mannerisms." The results of that process show up in the smallest details of Kimberly's design. Her scarf showcases traditional African print patterns, and it serves a narrative function as she wraps it around herself both when practicing her ninjutsu and when graffitiing art. You can't design something like that unless you understand that her culture and her daily life aren't separate things. Her athletic and competitive personality was drawn from Florence Griffith Joyner, an Olympic track star known for her bold fashion sense and fierce spirit. And her cassette player, which belonged to her uncle and plays 80s pop, grounds her nostalgia in specific family relationships and not just making her a Gen Z TikTok girl chasing a retro vibe. Every one of those details comes from a design process that asked who this character was beyond her culture, and the community's response has overwhelmingly validated that approach. One Reddit comment I found said, "This could be my cousin or niece." When people being represented see themselves in a character, the representation has achieved something that even the greatest character designers in the world couldn't achieve alone. Manon demonstrates Capcom's application of that same philosophy to a culture without the same historical baggage of stereotyping. She was pitched with a single key word: judo. The devs quickly realized that a straightforward judoka would be boring. The series is already flowing with Japanese martial artists. So they looked up which country had the second most Olympic medals in judo, and then they merged that with one of France's defining cultural art forms, ballet. I personally suspect that her movement was calibrated in anticipation of the 2024 Paris Olympics, as her kit is built around earning medals on successful throws. Her backstory emphasizes France's cultural value of family, including her two stepbrothers who are central to her character arc. The way she fights, looks, talks, her whole story, all of it comes from France. Manon wouldn't make sense if she were from any other country. She's specific in a way Street Fighter II's cast really were. But Lily showcases something else, that this work is ongoing and imperfect. As T-Hawk's spiritual successor, she was revised from her initial concept art. The war paint was removed from her face and she was given a denim outfit, reflecting Jarapejo culture, Mexican cowboy culture, with coloring that nods to the Mexican flag. That redesign is an enormous improvement over T-Hawk's muddled amalgamation of Apache, Navajo, and Aztec elements. Capcom had clearly started asking what would a young indigenous Mexican woman actually wear, and arrived at something modern. Unfortunately, Mexican players have pointed out that Lily's clubs are based on war clubs used by Native American tribes near the US-Canadian border. Despite being from Mexico, her visual language and gameplay draw heavily from a generic North American indigenous source, kind of treating every indigenous culture from Alaska to Mexico as interchangeable, and they're not. But please don't take this as a failure that invalidates Capcom's progress. This is just evidence that representation requires research so deep that even well-intentioned, highly funded teams can't do it perfectly on their first attempt. Lily is leagues better than T-Hawk, but she's also not quite right, and we should acknowledge both. But I can't move on without praising Marisa, because she represents an entirely different axis of representation. She breaks the long-standing series tradition that female characters have to be slender and conventionally feminine, because as much as people will try to argue otherwise, Chun-Li's thighs have always been framed as sexy first. Then again, power is sexy. But Marisa is framed entirely as powerful. She celebrates her size and strength without apology. She joins a broader cultural moment where characters like Zarya from Overwatch and Luisa from Encanto have proved that audiences, including young girls, respond to physically imposing women when they're depicted with warmth and confidence rather than played for laughs. Beyond the characters themselves, the best and most underappreciated element of Street Fighter VI's representation is grafted into the aesthetic DNA of the game. Producer Shuhei Matsumoto unambiguously details the title's artistic foundation. Quote, "After all, street is in the title. Graffiti, dance, rap, and DJ sounds. I want to include all 4 of these major elements firmly in Street Fighter 6. Those hip-hop elements extend far beyond the soundtrack. They're woven into the visual language of the UI, the stages, and the character animation. Even the combat feedback from the drive system's impactful strikes produces splashes of paint like spray cans hitting a wall. That carries immense cultural weight, as hip-hop is a culture born from Black and Latin communities in the South Bronx. And by centering it as Street Fighter 6's artistic language, Capcom is acknowledging that the cultures they stereotyped 30 years ago are the same ones producing the art forms that define the franchise today." Lead composer Yoshiya Terayama explains the thinking, quote, "We incorporate the culture and art of each country we represent. The instruments and techniques used are so important because they remind us of the history and culture of each country. The art team even specifically traveled to skate parks to do hands-on research with graffiti techniques. And both Nakayama and Matsumoto have been fans of hip-hop since their childhood. Nakayama is a Public Enemy fan, and Matsumoto has what he calls a more classical taste, as Dr. Dre is his favorite. But I'm certainly not implying that the answer is just hire fans and call it a day. Street Fighter 6 was made by people with a genuine relationship to the culture they were depicting, and they supplemented their personal knowledge with deep research. The game speaks a visual and musical language that's only possible because its creators respected the source material enough to study it properly. And before I wrap this up, this essay isn't some redemption story about Capcom having a crisis of consciousness and suddenly vowing to do better. They gathered 3 decades of feedback, cultural context, commercial data, and changing societal norms, and slowly rebuilt how they make characters around one idea: that the people you're representing need to be involved in how they're represented. And I know that sounds obvious, so the fact it took this long to become standard practice should tell you everything about how deeply the association model of representation was embedded into fighting games. But the implications go well beyond genre and beyond games entirely. Every legacy franchise across all forms of media that carry representational baggage from an earlier era faces the same dilemma Capcom did. Some of them chose to delete their problematic characters, but some chose to deepen them. Capcom did the latter. They kept Dhalsim and replaced his skulls with prayer beads, they kept Blanca and made him a tour guide, they kept Zangief and changed literally nothing, because as far as I could find, no one from Russia has ever complained about him. The end result is a franchise that respects its history without being imprisoned by it. What Street Fighter's journey ultimately proves is that authentic representation creates richer, more memorable characters than stereotypes ever could. Because when you know more, you make more, and when you ask the right people, you learn more. And now the only question left to ask is why it took so long for the industry to start asking. And I know that's a cliche line to end on, but I earned it because I'm the one that's gonna have to read the comments. For more Capcom essays, here's one about the apexes in Monster Hunter Wilds.